Okie dokie. Hello. Where do I start? Okay, so yeah, I'm going to preface everything by saying I intentionally I've left this quite freeform. As Lucy says, I'm kind of happy for it to spiral into any level of conversation or debate within that certain period of time before Katy then joins us. So yeah, just jump on in if you have anything that you want to say, because I'm not doing any kind of like screen-based presentation, but what I am going to do is drop in the old chat function some links. So anyway, hi, I'm Rhys Morgan. I'm an artist and producer based here in Plymouth. I have chosen not to do a presentation because I'm also studying part-time at Goldsmiths, and too much of my life is spent presenting my work to people, so I kind of just wanted an excuse not to present it in a formal kind of way. But I'm a queer practitioner. My work centers around lots of different ideas, but chiefly around like everyday queer experience, and how that might differ from kind of expected norms, or expected impressions, like stereotypes of what queer existence might look like, and how this plays with historical contexts of queer life, and also where it situates itself within kind of external worldwide power structures, I guess, and kind of narratives that have been built up over the centuries, I guess. I'm going to drop in some links to some recent work in the chat, and I'm sure there's some fantastic way of popping them along with the recording that goes out or whatever. So what I'm going to pop in is a piece that, and I'm doing this on purpose because I know that Rachel Grant is here from Aberdeen, and there's a piece that, there's a piece that's relevant to plans that are afoot that she knows all about, which is a piece I made last year under lockdown for an online commission that was organised by the curating duo Field Notes, are based in Cornwall, and it's part of a wider project called Texture Shots, which is something I started about a year ago, which was looking at how kind of still footage within landscapes and everyday life kind of can be used to open up the space for kind of poetics and ideas of romance, and how that can be viewed through a lens of queer experience. And this particular sub-project was called A Quiet Exile, and it was kind of exploring the narratives of like being in exile and what that looks like. And I guess kind of I was spurred on by the idea of lockdown kind of being like feeling like a kind of exile that we were kind of all put into. So I'm going to pop in a link to that. It's a web-based project, and there's also a link within the link for a video. I'm also going to pop in, and again, there's somebody else who knows this work very well. Rosie Barry's on the call here, so I'm going to pop in a piece called Interior off Straight Street, which I made for a group show in Bristol towards the end of last year, which was in a former soap factory from, I'm going to say, roughly Victorian. Yes, and that had then become a department store, and then was disused and was about to be redeveloped. And it was in part of Bristol, which is adjacent to what is known as Bristol's gay village. And I kind of started a project where I was trying to look at kind of how queer communities had, in a lot of cities, especially in Europe and also America, had established themselves in areas of kind of in post-industrial areas of cities, and what that looks like, why that happens, but what that looks like now, and what's happening to those communities as those areas become kind of redeveloped again, and what displacement has happened. And that project kind of didn't happen in the way that I wanted to because of lockdown. So what actually then became quite interesting was looking at how there was a foreshortening of kind of queer experience through, or a foreclosure through lockdown, and kind of like denial of access to queer spaces. And my reaction to that, and also kind of what I imagined that to feel like outside of myself as well. Yeah, I don't know, I'm going on a big list. And then the final thing I'm going to drop in the link for, so I'm going to do the website version, and I'm also, part of the reason I kind of put my name in the hat to be in the first kind of like, you know, whatever tombola for the Huddles, was because I've just come off the back of being a writer in residence for camp, which was between March and May/June this year, and which was around the idea of resilience, like the kind of theme, as it were, of the residency was around resilience. And I've chucked a link to the blog, but I'm actually, as a little exclusive to everybody here, if I can work out how to do it, I'm going to share a PDF of the final document that came from it, the final publication, because it exists, it's in my house downstairs, but unfortunately, due to a few technical reasons, I haven't managed to reach any members yet. But the resulting document, the resulting publication was a publication called Dislocation, which in which I explore resilience through the lens of queer resilience and what that looks like. And that's the main thing I'm bringing to the table today, I guess, because it was quite an interesting process, kind of exploring resilience, because I found it an irksome term, I guess. I wonder if that will share. There we go. It's gone up. There we go. So feel free to have a download of that. Yeah, I found it quite an irksome term because I felt like resilience often implies an element of heroicism and valor. And actually, as a queer person, you kind of get used to like being resilient, I guess, because you're so much gets thrown at you in your kind of day-to-day existence that resilience just seems part of day-to-day life. And actually, does it necessarily warrant the weight that it often carries when people talk about how people should be more resilient? And you know, there's a lot that's happened in the past year for me, in context, like that went into that work, breakdown of my last relationship, and having to the resultant kind of having to move from Bristol back to Plymouth, formed a large part of what I wrote about. And again, kind of that idea of relationships being resilient as well, and what that looks like, formed a big part of the inspiration for this work. But yeah, now I've sped through a load of things, so that's fine. But yeah, and I kind of don't know where to go next with it. So I'm going to start off now by saying, does anybody have any questions or anything they want to say? Let's have a look. Anybody moving? No. Okay, fine. All right, fine. That's fine. I can carry on spieling. It's all good. So, Rosie Bowery, come on down. Yeah.
Well, I mean, firstly, it all sounds very interesting, and it's nice to hear you talk about your work. Like, I see it as we go along, and I think it's nice to listen to you talk about it in a wider sense. But how have you felt like making this adjustment during lockdown and making work in lockdown? And how do you feel now that, particularly in England, we've gone from like 0 to 100, and like, how do you feel in like, from doing your camp residency? It's not even that much time from going you know, they're two completely different situations. Like, how do you feel moving forward is my question.
It's an interesting one, because I think where I would start in response to that is I wrote in that piece in the Dislocation publication about how lockdown, you know, and anybody who's ever been on a mailing list for the Arts Council, England, will have had these emails of your creative lockdown, and the kind of vibe of how productive you have to be because of lockdown was a real pressure. And then there's been this kind of like, I don't know, peaks and troughs of like how productive you should be versus how much you should be going out and enjoying yourself. And it's quite tiring. So I'm kind of after coming through all of the past few months, it's been really great to kind of keep busy and keep reflecting. And now I kind of feel like I'm in a very different place where I kind of want to stand back, but for many reasons I can't, but chiefly because I'm obviously, like I mentioned, doing the masters, so I kind of have to carry on the idea of production. But I feel like lockdown and that environment has been very weird for the art world, because I feel some people have really just lent into it and kind of like made it a kind of a period of opportunity creating. And then I feel like other of my friends and contemporaries are not like haven't like still feel a kind of like a leftover lethargy, which is completely fair enough. Lucy's asked me to show some of the PDF. Yes, I can do that. That's actually an extremely modern idea. Although to do that, we're all going to have to swear an oath. Oh wait, this is being recorded. We're going to have to swear an oath not to comment on the absolute horror show that is my desktop when I do the screen share. So let's find that. Here we go. Open that in. If I open it in Acrobat, this will take about 1,000 years. Let's go for preview. Okay, cool. Okay, how do I do the next bit? Okay, here we are. So I'm going to show you a bit of the... Oh my God, I can do it in full screen. Yes, there we go. Here's a bit of the publication. Great idea, Lucy, as well. Also, Rosie, I didn't mean to fall short on my response there, but I kind of felt I was running out of road. So but after a while, if I feel like I can, you know, come up with anything else, I will obviously come back to you on that. So here's the PDF of the publication. I'm going to skim past these pages. Here we go. So yeah, as you'll see from this page here, you know, I'll give you some chance to kind of like reflect on it, but yeah, I've been kind of so to wrap up the residency, we had a kind of get together, small get together, a few of us. Katy Richardson was there, and to kind of go over the ideas of what I'd been exploring. And ever since then, it's kind of stayed with me, and some of the things that came out of that conversation, because Robin Sullivan, who is a Cornwall-based artist, he was there, and he also did a talk for camp, or an in conversation with me for camp as part of not as part of my residency, but as part of the wider talk program. And he's really interesting practitioner who does work in clay, work in all sorts basically, but he's very interested in history and kind of queer narratives throughout history. And we spoke at length about how, you know, it says here, where is it? In reality, resilience can boil down to tolerance of that which is most unbearable, which is much less lofty than the the association to strength it evokes. And yeah, I think it was since then there've been several other moments that happened where I realized that as queer people, but also as artists as well, resilience is something that we really build into our everyday, and maybe we don't, either we do realize or we try and ignore it. Like it's quite an exasperating space, I think, being an artist, especially at the moment. And there's a lot of fighting, and not with people, but just against kind of like the elements and kind of a lot of structures, whether it be funding or kind of you know, different situations to do with galleries and stuff. I've been thinking about it, which I know, well, Lucy will know what I'm talking about there. Rosie's just sent me a really thoughtful question, which I'm going to respond to, actually. And I'm going to read out the question, which is, and I think it's relevant to kind of looking at the PDF as well. How do you feel about the language of resilience being used in wellness and in this horrid t-shirt selling Pride Month way? And what kind of impact does this have on how you experience the world? I think that's a really interesting question, because I think that really goes to the heart of what I find problematic about resilience, because I think basically there's a kind of a live, laugh, loveness to kind of like how we're sold resilience, of kind of like, this isn't a job for coffee, it's a job for Prosecco. It's that kind of like, there's a kind of mentality of like, you know, it's something to be fought. I guess, I mean, we had a conversation, and it's very, you know, there were problematics within it, but we had a conversation when we met as a group about how languages around kind of illnesses, so like, you know, the battle with cancer is something that's being kind of tried to get, people are trying to come away from it because it suggests that people lose a battle as though they're not willing enough to like make themselves well. And it kind of has echoes of that, of kind of like, oh, you know, you've got to be resilient, and you've you know, you like, and that's a badge of pride, that's a badge of honor if you've been resilient. And I don't buy into it. I think it diminishes a lot about where people don't fight. So an example that I'll put up here, so the kind of the composition of this publication is like lots of little vignettes, and they come from either stuff to do with the art world and my experience within the art world, or stuff to do with my former relationship and how I experienced that as a queer body in that situation. And this piece that I've just put up here says a lot about what I'm saying in terms of the kind of things that you have to go through as a queer person and as an artist, like where you're around powerful people who might hold particular views, and they say things that don't feel right to you. And, you know, some people would say it's more heroic or resilient to kind of like pull people up on stuff, but sometimes you don't feel empowered enough to do that, or maybe you just don't feel it's your place or it's the right time. And if people do have more power than you, then you're at their mercy if you then do pull them up on it. And you know that if they hold a high office in comparison to you in the city that you work in as an artist, that, you know, pulling them up on something might, you know, not do you service in the future. So you kind of shrink away from it. But I mean, even I'm using negative language there by shrinking away from, but like actually what you do is you kind of steel yourself and you go, cool, okay, well, you just made a really horrendous homophobic remark in front of me. I'm a queer person, thanks a lot, bye. Lucy's asked me a question, which is, are you going to carry on this conversation in your ongoing work? So in in essence, yes. So in terms of work that I have, plans for work that I have coming up, because my kind of the visual element of my work has become very different from what it has been in the past, which was, you know, a couple of years ago I was making work that was a bit more kind of appropriative in its approach. It was a bit more performative, and it was also a bit more led by kind of like really heavily led by theory, but just went straight into the work with no filter, well, with minimal filter. Whereas now I'm kind of really transfixed by a lot to do with diaristic approaches to the landscape around us, and how to queer that landscape and queer those spaces. And I think that in terms of this conversation around resilience, there's a lot to be said about being here back in Plymouth and back in the more deeper southwest than from Bristol. And so yeah, I want to explore that in the context of kind of like the heritages of the southwest, and what that looks like to queer communities, because the southwest has a very interesting identity around how it's built communities, and I want to explore how that looks with queer communities. There's one question that Rosie's put in. I know I've only got a couple minutes left, but I want to see if I can get in an answer to it, because it's also really good lols. When we started coming out of lockdown, it felt like it was done with Euro 2021, uber straight lads leading the charge. I feel like there is a connection between public spaces we're now allowed to go again, and then something else: straightness, loudness, who shouts loudest, anti-vaxxers. So, yeah, I think there is an inherent heteronormativity to how the unlocking has happened. I'm saying that very specifically because I'm now living in a space where there's less queer space than there were. So to me, it feels like it's a much more heteronormative space. I do know from people I speak to in the queer community that there's a real drive now to kind of like create more opportunities. So I think whilst that's been the predominant voice, and I think that's what happens when you have a Tory government that's not very interested in, you know, keeping an NHS going and that kind of stuff. I think that really lends itself to that kind of jingoism of kind of like, you know, football's coming home, so that's fine. Yeah, I think that in terms of how queer people can take up more space, I think I think they need to, but I think they need to be allowed more space as well. And I think that's, yeah, in terms of coming out of lockdown, I think the art world has a lot to say, has a lot to be responsible for there as well. And yeah, I think we need to look after queer artists better, and allow them not to just have, because you know, you're right, it did come at that point of Euro 2021. It also came at the point of, you know, Pride Month as well, as things started to unlock. And I noticed that the narrative around Pride Month this year was even more sickeningly kind of commercialized than it has been even before, which is weird because there isn't even a Pride parade this year to kind of like have Coca-Cola being a, you know, brand sponsor or whatever. So yeah, I don't know, but you know, I mean, you know, when none of us are, well, I'm not dead from COVID, so I guess I need to stop whinging. Anyway, that's the end of my time. I'm now going to hand over to Katy Richardson. I will be here later, although my boyfriend, who I haven't seen for over a month, is arriving at some point in the next half an hour. So I will be here, but I may not be on screen. So yeah. Anyway, Katy, come on down.
All right, so I'm going to talk about a current project which is in progress at the moment, and the ways in which it came about and where it's heading. So the project is called A Cake of Painted Tin. The basis of this work is a woman called Antonia White, and here you see two representations of her, one painted by Cedric Morris in 1936 and one photographed by Howard Coster in 1939. White was a British novelist and diarist who lived 1899 to 1980. The best known of her novels is a quartet often referred to as Frost in May, which is the title of the first of the four novels. But even these best known works of hers are strangely underknown. And I've wondered whether, unlike writers on similar subjects who are far better known, such as Virginia Woolf and Sylvia Plath, she made the mistake of getting old and not exiting the world as a young woman at the height of her beauty and intrigue. The four novels are autobiographical and describe White's early life and young adulthood, including her strict convent education, her expulsion from the convent for what was essentially creative writing, her time spent working as a governess, during which her ward died in an accident while under her care, and her consequent marriage to a friend who had also worked at the house where she was governess. This friend had been injured in the First World War and was an alcoholic. The last of the four books recounts in detail this unconsummated and miserable marriage and the beginnings of her first period of major depression in their marital home, a place she referred to as the sugar house due to its pink plastered interior walls. Finding out by chance that a Catholic marriage which has not been consummated is eligible for annulment, White leaves her husband and the sugar house, returning to live with her parents. Her depression then abruptly switches to a short period of extreme happiness and hope, accompanied by the belief that she has mental abilities that others do not. She writes of truths whispering to her from the air around, of a feeling of being connected to everything and part of a network of understanding and love, which some might recognize as panpsychism. Philip Goff, author of Galileo's Error, describes panpsychism as the most logical explanation for what we know so far about the world. He says, physical science doesn't tell us what matter is, only what it does. Once we realize that physics tells us nothing about the intrinsic nature of the entities it talks about, and indeed that the only thing we know for certain about the intrinsic nature of matter is that at least some material things have experiences, the issue looks very different. All we get from physics is this big black and white abstract structure, which we must somehow colour in with intrinsic nature. We know how to colour in one bit of it. The brains of organisms are coloured in with experience. The most elegant, simple, sensible option is to colour in the rest of the world with the same pen. Antonia White's mania, as the psychiatric profession would probably now call it, progressed rapidly, and towards the end of 1922 she was taken to Bethlehem Hospital following an episode of intense paranoia. She was experiencing what we might now refer to as psychosis, which was attributed to schizophrenia at the time, but which Patricia Moran now argues is better understood as a symptom of her probable manic depressive illness or bipolar disorder. At this time, Bethlehem occupied the building which now houses the Imperial War Museum. She would be there for the best part of a year, though her family were warned it might be much, much longer. When pressed, the doctors advised her family to prepare themselves that she might not recover until she was around 50, which implies that sexual maturity might have been thought to be one of the causes of her symptoms and that menopause might bring about the end of them. She recounts her experience in Bethlehem in the final novel of the quartet titled Beyond the Glass. In the first few months of her time there, she regularly lost all consciousness of being human and describes herself sometimes as a horse, a salmon, a mouse, and a tiny, quivering purple flower growing out of a wall. I first read White's Frost in May novels around the age of 13, and I have revisited them repeatedly. About 20 years after I first read them, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder myself, though I now believe this was incorrect. However, I mention it because of the other factors in the way this project, A Cake of Painted Tin, came about. So like I said, I've read these novels many times, and the most recent rereading coincided with my undergoing a period of EMDR therapy, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This was to treat the persistent effects of what has now been called CPTSD or complex PTSD. To be honest, I don't think these labels like PTSD and bipolar help very much, except as a shorthand to communicate. And for the purposes of this presentation, it's enough to know that I'd been struggling to cope with my thoughts and feelings for a very long time and wanted to do something about it, which led me to EMDR. So EMDR is a form of psychotherapy which was developed in the 80s by a psychologist called Francine Shapiro following her serious car accident. Noticing that her eyes were moving in an unfamiliar way following the trauma she had suffered, she gained access to recordings of other trauma survivors and noticed that the strange eye movement was common. And she made the link between this movement and the brain trying to process the trauma. The basics of the therapy are that the person being treated recalls the images which are causing them distress in order to desensitize and then reprocess them. The therapist then directs the person in one of several possible types of bilateral stimulation, such as side-to-side eye movements or hand tapping or auditory tones. The person being treated will focus on the disturbing memory, along with the negative thoughts and beliefs about themselves and the emotions and bodily sensations which often accompany it, while simultaneously following the bilateral stimulation provided by the therapist, which is believed to desensitize the trauma memories and activate the information processing system in the brain. This is believed to allow new associations to arise between the trauma memory and more adaptive information, which facilitates healing and mental wellness. The bilateral stimulation provides an anchor, keeping one part of the awareness in the present, while allowing another part to revisit the disturbing memories. EMDR has been shown to be able to move the targeted memories out of what is sometimes referred to as the waiting room of the brain, where trauma can become stuck and lead to symptoms such as intrusive thoughts and feelings and avoidant behavior. The reprocessing moves these stuck memories into something more like a filing cabinet, where experiences become narrative, therefore enabling the person to simply remember them. This is very effective for PTSD, relational trauma, and developmental trauma, since these conditions often trigger an unnecessary fight or flight response, which makes us feel as if the danger is still present. I had to do a lot of prep work to be ready for my EMDR processing, including learning some breathing rhythms, which I could use to bring myself back into the safe present of the therapist's office and avoid the brain's tendency for dissociation. I found it really interesting and helpful to learn that these breathing rhythms allow that oldest part of the brain, the reptilian fight or flight part of the brain, to be calmed, which then allows the neocortex or thinking brain to activate, which it cannot do when in fight or flight mode. Given that the reptilian part of the brain predates language and can therefore not be reasoned with verbally, successful treatment can depend upon this ability to physiologically tell the reptilian center that we're not in danger, which it understands, because this controlled breathing is not possible when an actual threat is present. These images are from a short video work commissioned by The Box here in Plymouth last year, which uses the rhythms of one of these breathing techniques to create a score for music made using just my voice, breath, and body. This work is not really suitable for sharing via Zoom, but I'd be happy to put the link in the chat afterwards if you're interested in having a look at it. And so during this prep period of about a year while I was getting ready for the EMDR, I came to realize that the image I had of myself was very damaged and very skewed. This was understandable since it had taken a battering in a variety of ways over a long period, but I hadn't ever before realized that one of the reasons for this continued skewing was down to a lack of functional, healthy female-to-female relationships. It began to occur to me that Antonia White and I shared this lack, and that for the first time in reading her books, possibly the 10th-ish time, I would guess, I noticed that she also seemed to have difficulty in forming and maintaining functional relationships with other women. From reading her diaries, I suspect too that she also had a very skewed self-image. And it's possible that this came about, as it did for me, through repeated instances of people proving themselves untrustworthy, harmful, and dangerous. And so how could either of us be expected to have a positive view of ourselves if that isn't how we experienced people around us? And if enough of the women around us show themselves to be untrustworthy and unreliable, how, as women ourselves, can our self-image be anything other than skewed in line with those models? However, over more or less the same period, I'd been helping to set up CAMP, this organisation which brings you all here today. Most of the other people involved were also women. And because of wanting this thing called CAMP to exist, I found myself creating ways in which I could work alongside these women, women who I would now call friends, colleagues, and allies. I'd never experienced this kind of supportive network of people before. And the idea that a whole group of people could be friends in a way that didn't feel temporary was completely new to me. Then, when the pandemic threatened to take these new connections away, I wanted to design a project which would work to offset the isolation, which for the first time ever was not self-imposed, and attempt to demonstrate and act upon my realization that I was able to make my experience different from White's, since she never seemed to find the trust and support in other women, which I think might have been as revelatory to her as it has been to me. And so I developed a series of experimental collaborative research sessions, which happened one-to-one between myself and 8 women practitioners of art, dance, photography, voice, performance, poetry, and psychotherapy, and also with my mother, who would not call herself a practitioner. In these sessions, we have been finding ways to bring Antonia White and her experiences into our time together, to hold them for her, to mix her experiences with our own, and to find commonalities. We found ways to share her endurance, her shape-shifting, her internal attempts at freedom, and her quiet moments of observing and listening. We have added these to our own experiences in an attempt to develop an empathy which exists beyond us and which might therefore be something she could tap into, or we could later when we need to. Spending time with these collaborators has facilitated connections of a different kind than those achieved by, for example, socializing, which often involves a lot of the terror commonly referred to as small talk. By focusing on shared actions, or directing each other, or responding to each other's movements, we were able to be connected across the digital space of Zoom by our shared bodily sensations, such as in this session when Carly Seller and I held ice together. It hurt, and I knew that I was causing Carly pain by asking her to do this, but I also felt a very strong empathy developing between us, the ice burning our skin in the same way while we tried to keep our eyes fixed on each other. Sometimes I led, and sometimes she did. Our hands became red and angry looking, dripping with the water that used to be ice, and we showed each other how to soothe them, and then when to pick up a new cube and do it all again. In other collaboration sessions, we have performed actions inspired by Antonia White's writing. Here, with Eleonora Roaro, we responded to Antonia White's recurrent theme of mirroring, duality, and the feeling of containing a kind of twin who would sometimes act on her behalf. In Beyond the Glass, White writes this about notebooks she had written in during her time in the sugar house. Some of the entries were almost illegible. When deciphered, they were so incoherent that they might have been written by a lunatic. One whole page, which she had no recollection of writing, was even written the wrong way round so that she had to hold it up to a looking glass to read it. She felt almost grateful for her present indolence and apathy. She was astonished, as well as disgusted, to find how violent her feelings had been. The creature who had written some of those pages had had a short memory too. Over and over again, some state of mind was described in almost identical words, as if it were being experienced for the first time. On her second reading, she could discern a rhythm in these recurring entries. It was like watching someone hurling themselves repeatedly against a wall until they fell back, exhausted and battered. The creature kept rising up again, full of absurd hope and good resolutions, only to go through the hurling and battering all over again. She shut the notebook and thrust it well out of sight at the back of a drawer. As she did so, she had a curious pang, as if she were burying something. The creature, heaving and wallowing in its morass of misery, had at least been alive. The mirror on her dressing table was in her line of vision. Her eyes shifted unconsciously to the square of glass. Her own face stared back at her, rigid and vacant, wearing a peculiar little smile. Following some long conversations about herbs, tea, and our relationships with our grandmothers, Leonie Hampton and I wanted to make something for White that she could find comfort in, something which we could use together with her. We made 3 clay vessels for drinking from, not speaking to each other while we handled the clay, but instead making improvised vocalizations, which combined with and responded to the movements of our hands. I thought about White often and the singing she had done while in Bethlehem, which was interestingly the only time she had felt allowed to sing outside the setting of a church service. And alongside these Zoom collaborations, I've also been working with the performer Alice Neal and videographer Amber Amer to make some imagery based on White's writing with particular reference to her time in Bethlehem. What I didn't predict, and what I now need to find a way to reflect in the outcome of this project, is how running the Zoom sessions alongside the film shoot has resulted in Alice not only being directed by the experiences that White wrote about, but by my shifting relationship to those experiences based on the ways in which my collaborators and I have reflected on and reconstructed them, adapted them, and brought them into the contemporary contexts of our own homes and lives. Imagery made with Alice and Amber to reflect passages of White's writing has started to find echoes. like White's untrustworthy mirror twin, in the movements and words of collaborators who do not know that imagery exists. So I've been taking these echoes back to Alice and Amber, with whom I then retranslate moments from the Zoom collaborations, making a web via interconnected imagery that builds on the themes developed in the collaborative sessions and puts them into the body of Alice, with which we are representing White. And so right now, A Cake of Painted Tin exists in the form of many, many hours of footage, which all have one thing in common, that they are echoes of White's experience across the almost 100 years since her incarceration at Bethlehem. Next week, I'm going into the sound studio with 3 more women collaborators and a woman sound engineer. And we'll be improvising and accompanying sound work using voice and breath. We'll be drawing on, amongst other things, female singing traditions, such as throat singing, which is often practiced by women and often by relatives, facing towards each other. And this is a type of singing which has long been used as a coping strategy. We'll also be drawing on communal sound-making methods such as those used in walking songs, which were traditionally sung by women in Scotland to accompany the process of felting cloth. So A Cake of Painted Tin will be shown for the first time this November, and my plan is to use a combination of the film shoot footage, the recorded Zoom session collaboration footage, and the sound studio work, and perhaps some objects and residues of the Zoom sessions themselves, such as the drinking vessels that I made with Leonie. But there are a lot of things there that I still need to work out, and that's going to be the next stage of the project. Thanks very much. And if you're ready, Liza, I'll pass over to you.
So I'm Liza. I'm the current artist in residence at Rain Projects. If I glitch out a bit, it's because I'm using my mobile data. I'm on Maker Heights, which is a site on the Rain Peninsula. So if I glitch out, that's why. So yeah, I'm currently studying at Goldsmiths, going into my 3rd year in September. So it's a really great opportunity to have sort of time this summer, keeping up momentum with my work and really sort of having the space to delve into a sort of a long form project with an exhibition at the end. So yeah, I'm just going to show you sort of a few bits of work that I've made over the past couple of years, and then go into the sort of beginning stages of my project here. So yeah, I'm just going to play this. So I predominantly make quilts. That's kind of the focus of my practice. My mum and my grandma are both quilt makers, so it's kind of like an inherited tradition in my family. I work, when I come home to Cornwall, I work in a fabric shop with my mum, so like textiles and craft is all very interlinked with my life. I was home educated and I kind of grew up making things as a way of sort of channeling my thoughts or processing my emotions, you know. So for me, quilt making, it's kind of like a alchemical process, because you're taking bits of fabric from everywhere. I buy a lot of my fabric from charity shops and loads of different fabric shops, anywhere that I can kind of get my hands on different sort of bits of cloth, and then they come together. You know, you cut them, manipulate them, and then bring them into this whole big piece of cloth that, you know, they become a final piece, as if they were always meant to be a single entity. So that kind of the idea of things coming together and pulling apart and sort of feeling of like polarity and push-pull. So as well as quilt making, that's my sort of main making process. And then when I show work, I like to sort of activate it with sound and performance. So for me, it's kind of like a back and forth between quilt making and sound. So if you've got quilts which are highly physical objects, they're very tactile and physical, and then sound is more ethereal and it's more out in the atmosphere. So yeah, that's the quilt that you're looking at now is one that I made during the first lockdown. I came back home to Cornwall for lockdown, so in between working at the fabric shop, I had lots of spare time just to kind of dive into really intense periods of making, of just sewing. So I was able to make this quilt, which is the inch squares. So it's tiny bits of sewing over and over again. And the process to make the pattern for this work was using a atmospheric noise random number generator, which is a way of getting a true random by recording data that's sort of in the air, like background static noise. So I like the idea of pulling information, pulling data from the ether down into these physical objects. It's kind of like the ethereal becomes physical. And then because quilts are for dreaming under, then the physical becomes ethereal again. And again, it's like that back and forth between two different states. The reason why I chose red, green and blue, that's a big motif in my work. I'd say it's kind of the focus whenever I do anything that's got colour in, it's red, green and blue, because of this sort of technological the technological element to it, with LED screens being made of red, green and blue light. It's the primary colours of light, but it's also the cones in our eyes are red, green and blue cones. So it's how vision is kind of formed by red, green and blue. And I like the idea of white light being split up into three primary states. Again, it sort of, it's like an alchemical process of splitting and coming back together. So yeah, this next piece of work was one of the first times that I put sound with textile. It's kind of, it's a bit of a sketch, I'd say, but it's the same process as the red, green and blue quilt, where it's a randomly generated pattern. And I was kind of thinking about granite when I made this, because a lot of the time I like to think of rock and physical matter as a sort of condensing down of information to the point that it becomes a physical object. So with granite, it looks like a static TV, but it's also an organic formation. So kind of seeing repetition of patterns and symbols across time. So yeah, I'll play the sound that this makes. So you can kind of hear that's like the crunching and crackling is almost like static. So then the quilt was made using the information, the static noise made into a physical object, and then it kind of loops back into atmospheric noise again by creating a system that will generate that noise. It's just using contact mics, so that when the fan blows, it registers the crackles of the fan hitting the fabric. So it's like, I like making closed sort of live loops of sound. And this is another work that does something similar. similar to that in a way. So the two quilts are sort of opposites of each other or inverse of each other. One starts from a white center and radiates out, then one starts from a black center and sort of collapses in or radiates out. So there's like movement in each quilt. And then when they're next to each other, it's like they have this sort of polarity that generates some sort of energy in between the two. It's like creating a magnetic field. So then to sort of further illustrate that or repeat that process, underneath the white quilt, there's a speaker, and underneath the black quilt, there's a microphone and effects pedals, just a guitar effects pedals to sort of manipulate the sound. So what happens is the feedback from the speaker and the microphone generate this sort of undulating, reverberating sound that then gets altered by people's presence in the space. If you talk in the space, you can hear it kind of echoing in this really slow, undulating way. So it's kind of like making sort of a magnetic field that you can feel yourself interrupting. You feel yourself in the space with the work, and that's what I like to achieve when I make some sort of exhibition or show my work. It's kind of, you know, turning the space into a staging for some sort of like psychic phenomena, or, you know, you can kind of really tangibly feel or see where you are in the space in relation to the work. So I'll just play a bit of the sound for this one. So yeah, you can just hear it's warbling, oscillating sort of sound. And that's oscillation and sort of back and forth dualities, polarity, push, pull, kind of the energy that exists between two opposites, or that sort of, I don't know what that is, the point between two things that's kind of hot and dense. That's what I'm sort of fascinated by. And also the idea of sort of glitches or supernatural events, or something like an eerie sort of situation emerging out of nowhere. So I like showing a lot of my quilts outside because they've usually got high contrast, like with this black and white one here. It kind of interrupts the space that they're shown in, or with the red, green and blue one, because it's got that digital language in the pattern. It kind of shocks the landscape that it's shown in and kind of reveals itself, or it's like a glitch in space. And I like that kind of opening up into other levels of perception. It's kind of like a glitch in the matrix or something. So this striped quilt is kind of like a illustration of time and sort of the condensing and expanding of time through different modes of experience. You know, when time goes really slowly, it stretches, and then when you're experiencing time just sort of slipping through your fingers, it's like it's condensing down, and there's always that sort of back and forth between fast and slow, different paces. I'm kind of leaning towards doing more performance work at the moment, especially with lockdown. So this year I was working on this quilt that was just 10 different shades of white, and it was this massive project I was working on for ages. But while I was at uni, everything was online, so I couldn't actually show it because it doesn't translate into a digital image, because it's subtle, it needs to be seen in real life. So I was kind of forced into performance as a medium, which has actually been really liberating. So I just kind of came up with this performance work where I drank a pint of water with one finger, just a whole pint of water, just by dipping my finger into a cup over and over and over again. And I sort of set it up as though, you know, sort of wearing my black outfit, sat in this checkerboard space that I'd made, ready to sort of be really poised and serious and kind of elegantly doing this meditative act of drinking this water with one finger. It kind of devolved into a really sort of ritualistic and animalistic process of just trying to get it done. There was moments when I was gagging or, you know, clanging the glass around just to get the water finished. So it's quite funny, the contrast between how you expect a meditative act to be and actually the outcome, where it was almost like I went into an altered state of just the only thing that existed was me in that room and that pint of water, and I needed to kind of finish the job that I'd started. So that idea of sort of, I'm a very obsessive person, which is probably why I do quilt making, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of dedication. It's kind of, I think, as a person that's very anxious and kind of has this perpetual sort of energy, I really focus that in on my work and kind of trying to get myself more embodied by practicing performance and making something physical with that sort of energy. I'm just going to check. Yeah, so this is a project from quite a few years ago, actually. I called it Menap Hilly. So I went to Menantol, Gwenap Pit and Goon Hilly. And the whole idea was sort of different sites of circular communication. So with Menantol, it's obviously it's a megalith, Neolithic site. It's a circle, that's the main sort of form. And then Gwenap, sort of concentric circles radiating out from each other. And then Goon Hilly with the satellite dishes. For me, it's something about circles. They're very, I think they're like a symbol of wholeness or togetherness, and a lot of powerful things happen in circles, like in stone circles, or like any of these sites. It's kind of, it's a place to sort of gather around. And that's kind of why I chose in the blue quilts to do concentric squares, because it was the most, that felt like the most true form of replicating a concentric circle in quilt making. It's quite hard to sew a circle, but yeah, I just kind of wanted to, with this sort of glitchy quilt, put it in the Cornish landscape and kind of shock it. Associations, it feels like magic, it's like time traveling or something. So that was all kind of in my head when I was planning my project for my time here. Yeah, so sort of really using the landscape, doing a back and forth of putting my work in the landscape, bringing the landscape into my work. But I had a project that I was planning to make a series of red, green and blue quilt, a red, green, blue quilt, one of each, and then possibly a cyan, yellow, magenta quilt, and a kind of exploring colour, and that was going to be the main sort of focus of my project. But as I got here and sort of the site sort of took over, and the histories and the sort of density of experience that kind of happens on the site, it kind of completely sidetracked what I was planning to do. In a way, it's kind of, now I'm working on my project is kind of like a Frankenstein of this series of quilts and sort of responding to the landscape. So what's so beautiful about sort of Maker and the surrounding areas is the different sort of, it's really tangible, the layers of history that are on the site. Like, army barracks are being used as a bar now, or there's plants growing over all these sort of World War II batteries, and then there's obviously the geological time of volcanic rock on the peninsula, and sort of abandoned buildings, reclaimed buildings, current activity, past activity. It's all these sort of echoes through the space. So like this fort that we found going on a walk to Kreml. Again, another circular building. So what I'm planning to do now for this project is, on sort of circumambulations around the site of Maker, I'm just taking field recordings, which I'm going to turn into a multi-channel, multi-leveled, live and recorded sound sort of installation, like with the quilt pieces that I showed, with this sort of live undulating sort of elements that responds to the people in the space, but then also with all these recorded sounds from the site, and sort of different paces of experience. Like, I've got sort of organic sounds of like the wind blowing through the trees, and then I've got sounds of me rushing somewhere on like a gravel path, or the sounds of engines or drilling going on downstairs below my studio, or a party that goes on in the field somewhere. So it's all these different layers of experience kind of condensed down into the now point of when the viewer will see the work, which will have its own temporality because of the live sound piece. So I'm kind of, I'm excited to share with everyone what that ends up looking like. I'm continuing on with the red, green and blue quilts as well. So hopefully I'm going to be making a speaker stone circle. So it'll be this sort of circular sound piece, and surrounded by quilts. So I'm kind of taking the idea of the red, green and blue being the primary colours of light. So it's like splitting and converging sort of. Yeah. So here's some more images of just walks that I've gone on during my time here. And I don't know, it's just beautiful to see all the different sort of levels of decay and reconfiguring that happens around here. Sort of nature, flora and fauna kind of taking over rubble, or there's spray paint on these old sort of military buildings. This building in particular has the most amazing resonance in there, so I took some field recordings in there, and it's this really long echo. So yeah, it's like all these hidden forts that are now turned into holiday homes. It's like this back and forth of military, industry, retreat and relaxation. There's all these different sort of energies happening on site here. And I think that's kind of, it feels like it mimics the process of quilt making, because you have to be so sort of regimented or industrious to kind of make, sewing on machine over and over again. It's almost like marching, or it's machine-like, but it's also very tactile and physical. It's like a collaboration with hand and machine. So it's the softness and hardness in the landscape kind of reflects the softness and hardness of quilt making, which is made with like needles and sharp objects, but is a comforting object filled with sort of a lot of love and time. They're sort of really embodied objects. So with that, I'm also going to do a performance in the space as well that will be all about sort of using my body as sort of a way of channeling the energies that I'm feeling here, and sort of illustrating the sounds, or kind of sort of getting back in touch with my body when I'm making work that's so disembodied. It's kind of, again, the back and forth between two two sort of polarities. So yes, this is one of the batteries on site. Again, it's a circular space, which there's something about that where it's, you know, you can converge in this round sort of space. You can see everyone that's there. I don't know, it's energy sort of flows around the space. So I'm going to try and make the exhibition circular. There's a little brick henge that I found in one of the buildings on the site somewhere. And it's quite funny because then I came back at the end of the day and just sort of set up these speakers and was playing around with sound experiments. And then my friend took this photo, and it feels like they echo each other. It's quite funny that, you know, even in an abandoned building, people have this impulse to kind of make these circular forms or these sort of like ritualistic sites. Yeah. And I'm just testing sort of some of the quilts out in some of the sites. And those are the two quilts that I've made so far for the project. So hopefully I'll have a lot more to show when I have my exhibition here at Maker. Yeah, so that's my talk done. So my end of residency sharing event is going to happen from the 13th to the 15th of August with a sort of private view launch evening on from 3 o'clock till late on the 13th, and I'll be doing a performance at 6:30. So yeah, pop down, come see what I end up making.